Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to get into a listener question. And we're going to leave this listener anonymous because they do share an experience based on their own.
Right.
So their question was on cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is one of those things that it can be really hard to understand because it's almost, I don't know, how would you describe it?
I think some people think of it in more complex terms than it really needs to be.
Okay.
And the way I think about it, if we divide the brain into two parts, I mean, this for me is about simplicity. So, sometimes I simplify it because the brain is actually a lot more complicated than that. But so if we divide it into two parts, and one part being the behavioral part, how we act, the other part being cognition, thinking, I put emotions over there as well. And our brain really likes both those parts to be the same. And so we have some discomfort when those are different. So we might believe or think in a different way, or in a way, and then we behave in a way that is inconsistent with what our beliefs are. And so the cognitive dissonance, again, in simple terms, is really a discomfort that you might feel or an unease that you might feel when those two parts aren't in alignment. There are a lot of good examples. And again, it's not very complex. So for instance, like if you believe in good health, you want to be healthy. And so you ought to exercise every day. And you know that there's a strong belief that if you exercise every day, you know that's good for you, which I think a lot of people would agree with that. But then you don't. So you have belief and then behavior, and you don't follow up on the behavior. And there's going to be some discomfort every morning when you don't get up and go exercise because you know you should, but then you don't. Same thing with, say, smoking or drinking.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would acknowledge that, especially around the smoking, not healthy for you. More and more evidence coming out that alcohol is really terrible for your brain. But then if you still drink, but you know it's bad for you, or if you still smoke and you know it's bad for you, there's going to be some discomfort. So in simple terms, that's cognitive dissonance. And once we get into the email and talk, because email is going to talk about trauma. So we're going to talk about this specifically with trauma, I think. And I'll give another example when we get into the email. That makes sense about cognitive dissonance? Or
It does. Yeah, it does. And I think really it's just in terms of like calling it cognitive dissonance, I think just graduate students or people who come up with these terms just like to make simple ideas complex.
Well, because that's how you get a dissertation out of it, or a master's thesis. I mean, you have to have a good word to describe it. So I mean, you could easily say, I feel uncomfortable when I believe something and then I do something opposite. But no, if we call it cognitive dissonance, that was somebody's dissertation way back when.
Yeah. So I mean, they attach these fancy things, and I think they make it more complicated than it needs to be because I think people just like research.
Well, I think that's especially true. I don't know if you've run into this, and this is a bit of a diversion, but for a lot of people, they may think of psychological research and people come up with models.
Yeah.
And the models drive me crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, because this is not a complex idea, whatever it is they're talking about. But I have to go through these steps and this decision tree, and I think this is a lot more in depth or complicated than this needs to be. But
what's the outcome? Does it change the outcome? Is really what it comes down to for me.
Right. But if you have a paper that you're writing, you've got to make it seem a little complex. So you're right. Yeah.
So I think in short, cognitive dissonance, I mean, it's really just when your behaviors don't align with your beliefs. That's it. That's it in a nutshell. Yeah. And I'm guessing that this listener's question stems from the episode we did on cognitive dissonance. And that's probably where this question comes from. So he shares an experience of growing up in a broken home. So this listener references this and he starts, firstly, let's say a child born into a broken home.
Right.
And then, they grow up and they form their sense of self based on empathy, but the environment is traumatic. So they go to primary school and face more trauma.
Bullying is
Bullying,
this
yeah,
person
through
was bullied in school, which sadly is
very
not
common.
uncommon.
Yeah, unfortunately. And so they start doing things that are not in line with who they are, which that fits into cognitive dissonance, right?
Right. And but I think it also fits into trauma. So I think we, in order to really answer this listener's questions, we have to talk a little bit about trauma and what it does and how one reacts to it. And so I'm sure that in past episodes, we have talked about the effects of trauma, because that's really his question. Growing up in trauma, what does that do to you? How does that lead to cognitive dissonance? And so in general terms, we know that if you experience trauma as a child, in an adult, there are all sorts of things that happen. Increase in anxiety, increase in depression. I think that for me, it's around trust. So if you think about a child, and we've talked about attachment and how important attachment is for everyone. And so if you grow up in a home where there's some trauma, often the attachment is disrupted. And what that does is it affects your trust or your ability to trust. And so as you get older and you may want to enter into relationships, I think that, and the listener doesn't talk specifically about this, but I'm just trying to generalize it around trauma. At least what I see in the office is a real inability to trust others and to be comfortable in intimate relationships. And so going back to trauma, I think one of the kind of fascinating and wonderful things I'm going to say about kids is they figure out coping skills that help them survive.
Yes.
In traumatic experiences. And so, and again, this is not from this listener's email, but I'm generalizing that often what happens is you learn to lie because lying keeps you safe. Depending on whatever the trauma is, lots of children learn to be hypervigilant so that they're really gauging what's going on in the room with their parents, with others. And the whole reason to be hypervigilant is to keep yourself safe. Like if a parent says, "Did you do this thing?" To keep yourself safe, you're going to learn how to lie, or a lot of children will. Yeah. So as you get older, and we've talked about the brain and how it wires, and so even though that line is not good. So here comes the cognitive dissonance. You are brought up in a culture and a society where lying's not good, but yet you have to lie in order to survive.
Right.
And so you don't want to lie, but your brain wires in such a way that lying comes easily. And I've certainly seen that. And so you get into, let's say, an adult relationship, and you don't want to lie in this relationship, but your brain is wired that that's how you stay safe. Is that, the truth is pretty flexible. And so again, you have that cognitive dissonance. I shouldn't lie, but I do because it comes pretty automatically. I think that's what he's talking about when it changes your behavior.
Yeah.
And I think that's the cognitive dissonance that he's talking about, that people can experience.
Right. And, and I think that really fits in with when he says this empathetic child starts doing things that are not in line with who they are. It doesn't have to be lying.
No, it doesn't have to be lying. I just wanted to give an example of what I think what it can be.
Yeah.
That's just a general example.
Right. And so whatever behavior he's doing, it's just a coping mechanism that he has developed.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I think is important.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's pretty, I was going to say cool, wonderful, but kids do that. But almost universally, the coping mechanisms that you develop as a child in traumatic experiences become really problematic as an adult.
Yeah. Yes.
So they work as a child and adolescent. They don't work as an adult in, especially in intimate relationships.
Hmm. Right. And so, and that's what he is doing. And so, yes, it might be cognitive dissonance, but it almost feels like a separate category to me because, I mean, it's a coping mechanism. This child
Hmm.
is trying to survive. And so, you know, in the terms of a child, when a child is doing things that aren't in line with who they are, I'm not going to place blame on that child, right?
Well, I don't think there's blame anywhere here. I think it's just,
Yeah.
I mean, even if you think, let's take it to an adult. And the
Okay.
example I gave earlier with smoking or
Hmm.
with drinking, it's still a coping mechanism.
Yeah,
If you
that's
think
true.
about it, I don't drink and I've never smoked. So I don't understand really what's going on with smoking, but I understand people who do that find it relaxing in
Mm-hmm.
some way. And I
That's
think the
true.
same thing could be said for drinking, that let's say you have a stressful life
Hmm.
and your coping mechanism is to use alcohol as a way to numb yourself and self-medicate. So you
Hmm.
know it's not good for you, but the coping mechanism is that you've got to do something for the stress instead of something healthy, like meditation or exercise, which we've talked about. And even then, I don't know that I blame. I think I understand it.
Yeah.
I think when you deal with people who are really, they're trying to make a change in their life, which I think is where we're going to go with this, because I think that's
Hmm.
his question in the end is how do you then change that behavior,
Hmm.
which we can talk about, or he even talks about choice in behavior, which
Yeah.
again is a really interesting idea that we can talk a little bit more about. How much choice do we have?
Yeah. And these are all valid questions. And so this is good background information. But unfortunately, the trauma doesn't end there,
No,
right? And
no.
so, because this child faces this in primary school, and then he goes through middle school, still dealing with the same thing. And then he goes to a boarding school in high school, but
Mm,
then faces physical and mental abuse from seniors.
yeah, which I
So,
understand is common in a boarding school. I mean,
okay, I don't
I
know
mean, you
much
have to
about
be in
him.
the in group, and if you're not in the in group, you're
Oh,
in the out group.
yeah.
It's pretty clicky.
Mm. This is so traumatic that they start contemplating suicide
Yeah,
for the first time in their life, which also goes strongly against their beliefs.
right.
So,
Again, that cognitive dissonance.
yeah. But
But
again,
again, they're looking for relief.
yes, this
I
is
don't want
all,
to do this, but I have this need for relief.
yes. And so, again, it's all a coping mechanism that is
Yeah,
developed because
right.
even in high school, well, I mean, because, and at this point, like, yeah, you're in high school, your brain is a little more developed, but it's still not fully developed. And you've
No,
already got inadequate wiring of the brain, or not inadequate, but improper wiring of the brain that's happened. So, I mean, that's a lot to face in the first 18 years of life.
right. And so if you think we haven't mentioned self-esteem, and so
Mm,
self-esteem, at least the way I conceptualize it, is that internal indication of how we think the world sees us. So if you're getting bullied, or if you're, I don't think this listener uses the term hazing, but it feels like hazing,
hmm.
in the boarding school. And if you're experiencing that, that really does a number on your self-esteem because it's
Mm,
pretty direct that those people around me or the outside world don't think very much of me.
yeah, right.
And so your self-esteem really takes a hit.
Hmm. So the story goes on to say, they get through this brutal phase of life with great academic success, which
Hmm.
is incredible because oftentimes when there is trauma like this going on, it's very hard for children to be effective
Yeah,
academically or to
right.
be successful. And so they're expected to be the same high achiever in university life. And I wonder if these expectations are expectations of themselves, and the listener doesn't specify this in his email, if it's of themselves or if it's from a parent or some sort of someone who is assisting them in college, right? I
Right.
mean,
It's true that he doesn't explicitly state who it is, but
yeah.
I read it that it comes from some external source, most likely parent. But
That's what it seems like to me, which again is probably pretty common. I mean, because
Yeah,
parents will often invest in their child's education and they expect them to get good grades, right?
yeah,
I mean, they expect them to be successful in college, right? You're
hmm,
paying a lot of
yeah,
money oftentimes. And so they have a mental breakdown and their university journey turns from 5 years to 9 years, but their home life has improved, but self-esteem plummets to new lows.
yeah. And that's that self-esteem I mentioned. I mean, if you're
Yeah.
getting hit from all these different areas, because I think self-esteem that's an important task of parenting, I believe,
Yeah.
is to help your child develop that self-esteem. And if you don't have that, and you're getting beat up on that
Mhm.
all the time, then it makes sense to me that self-esteem plummets. Yeah,
Yeah. Right. Oftentimes, too, I think once you finally get out of it, right? I mean, so their home life, to me, it seems like their home life has improved. And so they're finally able to deal with the trauma. And so they no longer have to hold on to those coping mechanisms. And so it's almost like that they're allowing themselves to finally deal with the trauma, but they don't know how. So maybe they're switching the coping mechanism. Does that make sense? What are your
yeah,
thoughts?
yeah. And so it's true that they no longer have to hold on to the coping mechanism, but the problem is that's the way their brain is wired.
Yeah, right.
So what we go into next is, and I think his question, he talks about it in choice of behavior, but we can look at it choice of behavior and how do you change behavior,
Yeah.
which is hard. And so we've talked before about Robert Sapolsky, his idea that we don't have free will.
Mhm.
But I think what we can say about our behavior, about really any mental health issue, emotional health issue, is it's always a combination between nature and nurture. So
Mhm.
there's certainly a genetic component that is in play, but there's also, how nurture is that idea of how we're brought up, how we're parented, how we're socialized. And I think that is really difficult to counter. And so your brain gets wired in this way. And do you have a choice? Now, as we've talked about it before, I think we always have a choice.
Yeah.
I don't believe Robert Sapolsky's idea that we really don't have a choice. But the question is, how do you do that?
Mhm.
So, one of the things I've talked about in previous episodes, I call it the behavioral roadmap. So, and so if we start with how do you change the wiring in the brain? Because that's what
Mhm.
we're working with, right?
Yeah.
This person grows up, trauma wires the brain, and you have that coping mechanism. So, how do you change the wiring in the brain? Can't change the wiring in the brain by thinking about it or having insight. The only thing that changes the wiring in the brain is behavior,
Mhm.
consistent behavioral changes. And so, how do you do that? And, and so, as I've outlined before, I think we all have the ability to choose who we want to be,
Mhm.
but often we don't really take the time to sit down and really think about it and write it down. We just go about it. We wake up every morning, we go about our day, and we may think, oh, I want to change something. I think that the process has to be more direct and explicit than that. So, for example, let's take the thing about lying. And again,
Mhm.
this doesn't come from the email, this is just
Yeah.
my own example. So, if you want to stop lying, how do you do that?
Mhm.
And so the change process in my mind looks like this, that when you have to decide, I want to be a person who doesn't lie. Well, what does that look like? So that's kind of the overall goal. That's the desire or the value. That's what I call it.
Mhm.
First you have to define the value. I want to be a person who doesn't lie. The next step then is to define behaviors. So a person who doesn't lie does this or this or this, and so you're really explicit in what those behaviors look like. I think often if you're trying to do this, it's good to look at someone else because you may not have that experience, but you could look at someone else that you know
Mhm.
or respect and think, okay, that person is an honest person. How do they behave?
Yeah.
And so you can model your behavior off that person, which in essentially what you're doing is you're reparenting yourself. You're trying to get that parenting that you missed out on. And you're
Mhm.
doing it yourself by looking at someone else who's got that behavior. And then you have to be really direct on how you change the behavior because your brain doesn't, the wiring doesn't change until you have that consistent change in behavior. And the way I think that looks is that, let's say at some time you lie, you have to be aware that I just lied. And it can be like if it time X is the way I define it, and then sometime later, and it doesn't really matter how long that is, if you realize, oh, in that situation I just lied. I think it's really important to go back and change it. So if you lied to a person, to say, you know what, I wasn't truthful or honest with you. Here's what I should have said. So it's like you're correcting the behavior and, acknowledging that you're trying to change that behavior. I think what happens over time, if you're consistent in doing that, in correcting the behavior, then the time at which you realize that you've lied gets shorter and shorter and shorter until you're more aware of it. You might be aware, oh, I just lied. And then right after you think, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Yeah. And you correct it. And eventually what happens is you don't lie anymore. Right. But that time drops to zero, where what that means is you just aren't lying because you've changed the wiring in the brain. And sadly, it doesn't happen quickly. But I really think you can take any behavior that you want to change. And if you define what you want to do instead, what is the alternative to that behavior? And then anytime you do the undesired behavior, you correct it with the desired behavior over time, then it changes. But you have to be pretty vigilant. And every day you have to be vigilant. And that's the hard part.
And well, right. And I think the whole process is hard and it's going to take a lot of time. And that's, I think, what we struggle with the most is time and consistency. Yes. Well, or consistency, I think, is what we struggle with the most. Yeah. Right.
We live in a culture where we think everything ought to happen quickly and we want it to be easy.
Yeah.
And this isn't easy. And it takes time. Yeah. It takes focus and it's hard. But I really believe people can change that. Well, I think they can change their behavior, but I think one of the most important steps is you have to be able to define it. You have to define, how do you want to be? Who's the person you want to be? Define the behaviors and then follow the behaviors. That's what I call the behavioral roadmap. We all have the ability to define who we are, who we want to be. You just have to be explicit about it.
Right. So I want to read a brief paragraph from this listener email to really kind of get the phrasing right of this question.
Okay.
So he says, I think at first external trauma over an extended period of time can cause cognitive dissonance, and then internalized trauma or low self-esteem can keep the dissonance going. I don't know if this is correct or not, but how does one who finally recognizes this try to reconcile with themselves? You said a person can change their behavior, but if they don't recognize it's a problem, then there is no internal incentive to change. So you answered kind of the first part of, how you can change, but how do you recognize the behavior in the first place? And well, in this instance, I think the listener it sounds to me like he has recognized there's some problematic behavior. But, speaking of this in more general, I don't know that you do. If you don't recognize the behavior, if you don't see it as a problem, I mean, I think the only way you recognize it is because either somebody points it out.
That's right. I think that what happens is I mentioned how childhood trauma really negatively affects your ability to be in intimate relationships. And so what happens often is you enter into an intimate relationship, and then that, whatever the behavior is, becomes problematic. Yes. And the person you're with then is the one who says, hey, this particular behavior is problematic in the relationship. And that's how often you understand what's going on. I mean, one of the problems is you can be defensive. If someone says you're doing this and it doesn't work, I mean, a natural response is to become a little bit defensive about it.
Yeah.
But if you really want to be in that intimate relationship, then you start listening and thinking, okay, maybe this behavior doesn't work very well. But often, I hear this often, people will say, oh, that's just the way I am.
Yeah.
I understand it when they say it. It always, in my mind, I don't say this, but it always feels like a bit of a cop-out. because, they're taking the easy way out. I can't change. I think you can absolutely change those behaviors. And it depends on your motivation. Do you want to be in that relationship, or do you want to continue with the behavior? And that behavior would likely be problematic in any relationship that you enter into. So again, there's your choice. Do you want to change that so that you can have a fulfilling relationship, or do you just want to go on throughout your life having that problematic behavior?
Right. And I think that this listener is right that there's no internal incentive to change if you don't recognize the problem. So you do need,
That's true.
right? You're not going to change if you don't, if you're just fine the way you are. But I think maybe another way where you can recognize that in yourself is if you have this pattern of failed relationships, or this pattern of or failed anything, right? Or if things in your life just
like failed
yep,
jobs or
yep.
difficulties in employment are often about this. And again, if you have that difficulty, you have to be able to say, okay, what's going on? So there has to be some desire for insight.
Yeah.
But if you aren't interested in what's going on, if you have that pattern, you called it a pattern, that's really what it is. Pattern in jobs, patterns in relationships. If you aren't interested in figuring that out, then you're right. There's no incentive to change.
And I also want to acknowledge that sometimes there are people who just, they just have bad luck, call it what you want, right? Or just unfortunate things just keep happening.
Yeah.
But if there's a consistent pattern, then I think sometimes it can be hard to recognize. And I think it can be very easy for people to just fall into this trap of, well, I just have bad luck. I just have bad luck. Yeah. But it could be both. Sometimes people genuinely have hard things that happen to them, and then other times it's just, it's ineffective coping mechanisms.
Right.
So his next question is he said it's a little bit more straightforward. How does one recognize their own self? And he uses an analogy of a compass that always points north. A person who knows what they are can be said to know which direction is north, but how do they define north in the first place? So that when they inevitably get blown off course by the wind, they can use the compass to navigate themselves again.
Well, going back to what I said, you get to define what north is. What is north for you?
Exactly.
And that's going to be different for every person.
Yeah.
North, but you get to decide who you are. Going back to the main question is about cognitive dissonance. You can define who you are. Does your behavior then, is it consistent?
Yeah.
With your belief system? And that's where that's where cognitive dissonance happens. It's also where you can decide, well, I want to change the behavior so it's consistent with my definition of what north is. So I hear this often, that people come in with this idea, I don't know who I am.
Right.
My response is always, decide who you want to be.
Yeah.
It's not like you come with, I suppose again, if you go back to nature and nurture, a lot of who we define ourselves as comes from, say, our family of origin. There's also a genetic component. But as an adult, or even as an adolescent, lots of times we start thinking about, okay, who do I really want to be? And that idea of individuation. And so they say, I don't know who I am. My response is, well, go ahead and define it. Yeah. Decide who you want to be. And you are in total control of that.
I'm not going to say at this point you're starting off with a blank slate, because you've had all these experiences that have already happened that you can't change, and you've already had a lot of wiring in your brain that's already developed.
Right.
But
you aren't a blank slate, but then the idea is, can I change the slate? Can I change the writing on the slate?
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
I think that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
My belief is that yes, you can, or I wouldn't be doing what I do if I didn't believe that. Now, I acknowledge there are some people who really believe you can't change the slate. But I don't agree with that.
No. You can't change what happened, but you can always change what you're going to do. You can always choose to do different, choose to be better.
You can define your north.
Yes.
In using his example, you get to define what that is.
Right. So I'm going to make a little bit of an inference here. It sounds
Okay.
to me like he spent the majority of his life just trying to cope
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
trauma. And
I agree with that.
he's finally in a place where maybe there isn't trauma. And so now he doesn't know who to be, what to do, because he doesn't have things to cope with anymore. So now he gets to decide.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't think of it that way. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
surprised at the people that I talk to who have never thought of that as an
Hmm.
option
Yeah.
that, oh, I get to define who I want to be. But you can't just say, okay, I'll define who I want to be and go on about your life. You've
Hmm.
really got to sit down. And I
Yeah.
suggest writing it down or typing it in a computer, whatever it is. You've got to really think about it. And I believe it's a lifelong process
Yeah.
that you're always thinking about, okay, do I want to be this? Do I want to be that? And we're dynamic through the lifespan. We aren't static.
Hmm.
And so it's a process that does change. I think as you get older, like someone my age, it becomes less and less because, I mean, if you've gone through this process, you're pretty well defined as who you are and who you want to be. But he does give his age fairly young, certainly in a place where he can still do this process.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, for me, we give takeaways often from our
Hmm.
episodes. And for me, that's a takeaway that
Yeah.
you really get to define who you are. And if you're unhappy with who you are, or if you have that cognitive dissonance, if you're behaving in a way that is inconsistent with
Hmm.
your belief system,
Yeah.
then change the behavior. I mean, you have two choices. You can change the belief system
Hmm.
or you can change the behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, again, that's your choice.
Hmm. Right. And is one easier than the other? I don't know.
Um, is one easier than the other? It's a good question, Liz.
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know that I have an answer to that.
Yeah. I mean, because I think our behavior is driven by our beliefs, right? Which is
Well, okay, now there would be, I think in some ways I disagree. Sometimes our
okay.
behavior drives our beliefs.
Yeah.
It goes both ways. There's a two-way street
Yeah.
between them.
Yeah.
Behaviors influence cognition and emotion influences behavior. What I do explain to people, I think if you're trying to change one or the other,
Hmm.
if you focus on behavior, that tends to change your belief and more quickly.
Yeah.
If you just focus on the cognition and the emotion, for that to then change the behavior is a much slower process.
Hmm.
To me, that's the example I've used in the past. Is that the old Freudian psychotherapy model, which is
Yeah.
you're in therapy for 3 times a week for 20 years, and then all of a sudden you get this tiny little change
Mm.
because you're focusing only on the inside. I think it's more effective to focus on the behavior, which is
Y-
defining who you are and then act that way. That then changes your belief system.
Yeah. That's good insight. And
Mhm.
so going back to his question, how does one recognize their own self? Well, I think you look at your behavior.
You look at the behavior and then you define it. Do I
Yeah.
want to behave this way?
Yeah.
What is problematic about my behavior? And again,
Hmm.
we as we said, sometimes it's hard to see what's
Yeah.
problematic unless someone else that you're with is pointing it out, which could be an intimate relationship or it could be a boss, could be a
Hmm.
manager, something like that. And so listening to others' reactions to your behavior might be the best way for you to realize, okay, there's something I need to change.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, you have the choice. I mean, you can decide, no, I'm not going to change that. And then you're still going to have the problems in the intimate relationships. You're still going to have the problems in employment if you don't
Hmm.
change it. But you get to decide.
Yep. So his final question is regarding criminals and trauma. And this was something that we touched on when we did our episode on cognitive dissonance. If you go back and listen to it, he said he's sure a lot of criminals do not grow up wanting to be a criminal, which I agree with. I can't imagine any 5-year-old saying, I want to grow up to be in prison. I
Hmm.
don't think that happens.
No.
So, but he makes a good point that a person is a product of their environment. And if
And
that
genetics. So it's both.
right, and genetics. And if that environment is acting against you, I mean, you could reach a breaking point. And he makes a very good point, right? That if something snaps inside of you or something dies inside of you, is the way he describes it. Trauma could kill the voice in your head that stops you from acting against yourself.
even with criminal behavior, I think we could make a strong case for it being a coping mechanism.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you think about like gang violence,
Mhm.
I mean, we know
Mhm.
that a lot of people enter into gangs because it is really about creating another family. So their own family of origin is dysfunctional, disrupted. And what gang life does is it gives them that idea of community. Now, it's an unhealthy community, but
Yeah.
again, I think it becomes that coping mechanism. And so if we take it to an extreme example, and I think we've talked about sociopaths.
Mhm.
Now, there is a strong component to a strong genetic component, I think, to being a sociopath. But again, it doesn't mean that you're always going to behave, say, in a criminal way. It's
Mhm.
just you have that combination of the genetic component and then how you're brought up.
Yeah.
But I do think for a lot of criminals, it's like, for example, maybe you don't have enough money, you're struggling, the environment in which you grew up in, you feel hopeless, you feel like there's no way for you to make an adequate living. And so
Yep.
sometimes it's a coping mechanism. I need money, so I'm going to turn to crime because it's the only thing I can think of. And so again, you always have a choice,
Mhm.
but I think it fits that pattern, what we've talked about is coping mechanism. So again, you get to decide if you want to spend time in jail, if you want to, live that type of experience, say in a gang.
Mhm.
Again, that's your choice, but there are always consequences to choices. To any
Right.
choice we make, there are
Mhm.
consequences. And you get to decide, do I want that consequence or not?
Right. And he acknowledges this in the email. His last bit is, you know, he says that you could always answer away with something cheesy like people always have a choice. But he says part of being human is sometimes we feel like we don't have a choice. And I
And
want to
I believe
acknowledge,
that. I think that's
yeah,
true.
yeah,
I think he's accurate in that there are many people, and maybe, some of our listeners
yeah,
who feel like they don't have a choice.
hmm,
You'd have to look at each situation. But
yeah,
I hear that often
yeah,
from clients. I don't have a choice. When you really start thinking about it, you do. It's just the how you change is
hmm,
really, really difficult.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so I believe that we have choices. They're not easy.
yes. I, and
I think that they're very difficult often.
yeah.
And so I do want to acknowledge that.
And there are certain things that we don't have control over. I think it's important to acknowledge that, right? For
Yeah.
example, most people don't choose to get fired,
Right.
right? Or if you get let go of your job, or if you get laid off, or if you get fired, that wasn't your choice. You didn't get to choose that. But
No, but in some cases it could be behavior that leads you to get
yes,
fired. So
yes,
in some cases it's not. It
yeah,
could be just reduction in work.
yeah. So I mean, and I think it might be worth considering what would happen if you didn't make that choice, or you did make the hard choice. So I'm thinking of a personal example, and with my son, right? Because with my son, we can often say, or I feel like I didn't have a choice in getting a surgery for him. Did
Hmm.
I have a choice? Well, the answer is yes, I
Yeah,
did
you
have a
do have
choice.
a choice.
I could have chosen not to get the surgery, but what would it look like if we hadn't gone with this surgery and this G tube to help manage his condition? We would be
Well,
in the
you knew what
hospital a
it
lot.
looked like because you'd experienced it
Yeah.
for several months. And so
Hmm.
sometimes you make a hard choice
Yeah.
because you already have the experience of what that looks like. So we're going to try something different.
Yeah. But I could ask myself, what would my life be like if we had decided no, this surgery isn't the right option? What would my life look like if I had done that? We would have this constant worry and nagging hanging over our head, right?
Well, you'd have a lot of hospital visits because that's
Yeah.
what, right? And
Yeah.
and you knew what that was like and how
Yeah.
traumatic and difficult that is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and so again, what the
Hmm.
consequences. Again, there are consequences for any choice we make. You choose not to do that, there are
Yeah.
consequences for that.
And you know what? The going with the option of the G tube, that's still hard. And
Yeah,
so I guess I really like the
right.
phrase choose your hard.
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard this before. Marriage is hard, divorce is hard. Choose your
Right.
hard. I don't
That's
think
right.
marriage has to be hard. I think you can make marriage not as hard.
I think often people think of divorce as the easy way out. In some ways, I guess that might be true, but there are so many unintended consequences
Yeah.
that come from divorce that a lot of people never think about. And I think I've mentioned this before, that fully a third of people, so, that's a lot. A third of
Hmm.
people who get divorced eventually wish they had not.
Yeah.
They regret the decision.
Right. Okay. So this episode was so long that we're just not going to do an episode next week.
Okay.
Okay, no, not really. But
Uh,
this episode has gone long, but I think it's been a good episode, and I think a lot of insight into, I mean, just how we
well,
cope with trauma
yeah,
as
trauma,
children. Yeah.
cognitive dissonance,
Yeah.
and behavior change.
Yeah.
So
Which
thank
are
you to the listener for sending this in.
Yeah, this I think was a really fantastic episode. And,
Yep.
Mark and we enjoyed, picking this apart and really defining
Hmm.
some of these things because, I mean, dealing with trauma it's hard.
Yeah,
And,
it
and
really is.
as a child, you don't get a choice. That is one thing that you don't get a choice. You don't get to choose really what your childhood is like, but you get to choose what your adult life
Yeah,
is like.
and that's why you don't have power, and that's why children develop those coping mechanisms because it gives them a sense of control and power.
Yes. So takeaway: Robert Sapolsky is wrong.
Well, I I think so. I think it's an extreme idea.
Yeah.
If you read his book Behave, I think he's got some really good ideas, and I think I've said this before that I think the benefit of that is it helps us to look at the physiological component of behavior
Yeah.
more than we probably do.
And the physiological component is important because we are very much driven by instincts and hormones. I mean, if you think about it, our might come down to Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Hmm.
right? Which is a whole other thing. But I mean, we are driven by our need to eat. We are driven by our
Yeah,
need to sleep. We are driven by our need to excrete, right? The bathroom
and procreate, have
and
sex. I mean, yeah,
procreate.
yeah. I mean, he's got a good point. I think he just
Yeah.
takes it too far, personally.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Plus, it's an interesting read. I'm not saying don't read it.
Yeah.
I really like his stuff.
Yeah.
I just don't agree with all of it.
And we are certainly driven by our need for human connection.
Yeah,
That
that's right.
I think that's where it gets the most complicated. I think
Yeah,
it's that need for human connection that complicates and muddies life so much.
it does.
Okay, so next week we will be out.
Yes.
So Mark is taking a vacation.
Yes.
So there will be no episode next week. When we get back, we're going to, I don't know, maybe you could almost consider this a little bit of a continuation.
I think a little bit. I thought about that when we were talking about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So
As far as the cognitive dissonance
yeah.
that occurs. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's titled Leaving the Faith. And episode is going to come from a lot of different angles, right? So we're going to talk about when either an adolescent or an adult decides to leave the faith that they were brought up in and kind of what that looks like. But we also want to talk about it from the aspect of the parents, right? How the parents can cope with that in a healthy way. And I'm going to give our disclaimer now that Mark and I are not trying in any way to disparage or come against any religion, right? I want to make that clear from the outset. But this is, I think, something common that happens. And I think it's going to be an interesting perspective because Mark and I are going to be able to give two different perspectives on this. So, I mean, on the one hand, I'm a deeply religious person whose life revolves around their faith, and Mark is
for me, I've left the faith, so
yeah.
That's my experience. So,
yeah. So it's going to be a good episode, and we're going to talk about how it's possible to reconcile.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
All right, we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.